Hello again. I wonder sometimes if I'm not suffering from some species of multiple personality disorder, and that those who post comments here denouncing me might secretly be my sock puppets. I say this because very often their comments make them look like unmitigated fatheads, but also give me the opportunity to launch a counter attack, as it were, and underline what I've already been saying. I find this rather curious. It happened a few days ago when I mentioned that most of the accounts of slavery in America and the Caribbean which we possess were actually written by white abolitionists. I'm thinking of things now like Uncle Tom's Cabin, 12 Years a Slave, Mary Prince's life story, and so on. After I said this, a few people popped up in the comments and asked if I'd ever heard of Olaudah Equiano. Oh, yes, they were quite right to mention it, because the story that he wrote is indubitably the work of a black man, the unaided work. He wrote the book without any help at all, and it does give a very interesting picture of slavery in the 18th century. I have an idea that those who suggested that I look at his book, which I've read years ago anyway, probably hadn't read it themselves, or they might not have been so quick off the mark, because his account has as much to say about slavery in Africa as it does about slavery in America and the British Empire. And from all that we can make out, slavery in the British Empire was probably a lot better and more agreeable than being a slave in Africa. In the description to this video, I provide a link to a free copy of Equiano's book, so that viewers can read for themselves and check that what I'm claiming is actually true. Olaudah Equiano was an Igbo. That meant he lived in what is now southeast Nigeria. He grew up in a part of Africa where slavery was just an everyday thing, an accepted part of life. He describes his family home thus: "My father, beside many slaves, had a numerous family of which 7 lived to grow up." And this is how his tribe lived. "The master of a family has a large square of ground fortified with a moat, and contains houses to accommodate his family and slaves. The habitations of the slaves and their families are distributed throughout the rest of the enclosure." It sounds a little bit like a southern plantation in America with the slave cabins, slave quarters. Here's Equiano describing how in his village they acquired cooking pots and so on by exchanging things with traders. "Sometimes we sold slaves to them, but they were only prisoners of war, or such among us as had been convicted of kidnapping or adultery or some other crime." It's perfectly plain that slavery was just a normal part of everyday life in West Africa in the 18th century. Then one day Equiano and his sister are captured by slavers. These men are fellow Igbos, and they take the children off to sell in another village. "One day when all our people were gone out to their work as usual, and only I and my dear sister were left to mind the house, 2 men and a woman got over our walls, and in a moment seized us both, and without giving us time to cry out or make resistance, they stopped our mouths and ran off with us into the nearest wood." Some accounts of slavery have heartrending tales of families being split up when slaves are sold at auction, so that parents are separated from their children and brothers from sisters and so on. Exactly the same thing happened in West Africa without anything to do with white people. Here's Equiano describing how he was separated from his sister. Remember, he was only a child at this time. "The next day proved a day of greater sorrow than I had yet experienced, for my sister and I were then separated, while we lay clasped in each other's arms. It was in vain that we besought them not to part us. She was torn from me and immediately carried away, while I was left in a state of distraction not to be described. I cried and grieved continually, and for several days I did not eat anything but what they forced into my mouth. These aren't white slavers, they're Igbos. They belong to the same people as Olaudah Equiano. After being sold to one person, he was then sold on to someone else and eventually sold to white slavers and taken across the Atlantic. He says that he had to work longer hours as a slave for the British, but apart from that it seems he was very well treated. When he's taken to England, my master lodged at the house of a gentleman in Falmouth who had a fine little daughter about 6 or 7 years of age, and she grew prodigiously fond of me, insomuch that we used to eat together and had servants to wait on us. When we arrived at Guernsey, my master placed me to board and lodge with one of his mates, who had a wife and family there, and some months afterward he went to England, and left me in care of this mate together with my friend Dick. This mate had a little daughter aged about 5 or 6 years, with whom I used to be much delighted. Her mother behaved to me with great kindness and attention, and taught me everything in the same manner as she did her own child, and indeed in every respect treated me as such. His master was a sailor in the Navy, and when Equiano writes about his life with this master, it doesn't sound any different from the life of any young servant at that time in Britain. He says, "From this ship my master was appointed a lieutenant on board the Royal George. When he was going, he wished me to stay on board the Preston to learn the French horn, but the ship being ordered for Turkey, I could not think of leaving my master, to whom I was very warmly attached, and I told him if he left me behind it would break my heart." He's baptised, he learns to read, he's taught a trade, all sorts of other things. It's all so different from the books written by white abolitionists that one seems to be in quite a different world. There's no doubt that Olaudah Equiano was better off as a slave in the British Empire than he was as a slave in Africa. Reading this book is interesting as it shows slavery from a black rather than white perspective. There may well have been some cruelty, but there was also great kindness and affection between master and slave as well. To that extent, it puts me in mind sometimes of Margaret Mitchell's account of slavery in Gone with the Wind. And yet this book was actually written by a black slave.